Everyone, and today we're back exploring trench life as we look into what would be going on for a soldier in the trenches on days when there weren't any attacks going. And welcoming back Dr Simon Peaple. We'll see you there. Well, Dr Peaple, welcome back to the programme.
Thank you for having me back.
So, last time, I believe, we mentioned that some of the trenches ended up within hand grenade throwing distance of the enemy. How often were troops actively engaged in combat with the enemy?
That was the exception. Sanctuary Wood in the salient was one of those where it was particularly close to the enemy. So the basic distance was often further than that. So, for example, at the double Crassier on the lens front, it was nearly half a mile between the trenches. So there was a much greater distance on some of the particular fronts. It just depended on where the troops had finished up, and so a lot of the time they weren't directly going to be able to attack each other, though there were frequent attacks.
When you say frequent attacks, just to clarify, would it be reasonably common how common do you think it would be for a soldier to go a day in the trenches without any combat taking place?
In terms of combat, quite regularly they would go without that feature, but the level of shelling could happen. I mean, you can read accounts where maybe 200 or 300 shells fell around a battalion's position. Fortunately, maybe only a couple of people would be wounded. It wasn't guaranteed to do any huge destruction because the trenches provided a lot of protection. But nonetheless, there was many days, or there were many days, when there would be no direct combat. So trench life fell into a routine, and that I think is the focus of what we should explore today.
Well, thank you for leading us nicely into the next question. What would be the routine of a soldier in the trenches?
Well, if we take the sort of view that we focus on the British Army, which would be pretty standard in terms of some of the routines, but the French were on the whole very similar in their approach, except that they would be usually less well fed than the British. The British on the whole were the best fed army on the Western Front. The Germans similarly followed a pattern, but again certain sort of facets would be slightly different. But the basic routine that became established was one which effectively swapped day and night. So because the trenches were near enough to be observed, and remember that the British had nearly always got the lower slope, certainly in the early part of the war before they gained any ground, they would usually be on the lower position to the Germans. So everything had to be done under observation, and therefore most of the activity would be done at night rather than in the day. So if you imagine a sort of semi-permanent night shift approach, it took a lot longer for them to decide to attack at night, but the night time was the key time. So if you were to sort of start with early morning, then around 6, but the time would vary a bit according to the part of the year, you would get what was called reveille, which is the wake-up call, and then a stand to. And the anticipation was that the enemy would be most likely to attack at or around dawn or just early light, and so you would be standing to on the fire step of the trench or at readiness, with everybody sort of really sharply aware that this was the moment when it might happen. So the first part of the morning would be tense. Frequently, obviously, nothing did happen because there were not attacks every day by any means. But everybody was sort of, aroused and ready. Certainly didn't pay to be not a morning person in the trenches. But once that had happened and everything was clear that there was not going to be an attack, there might have been a bit of shelling because it was known that the trenches would be fairly full at that point. So if you were going to drop a shell down and one of them did go in the trench, it would do more damage. So there would be quite a likelihood of trench warfare subject to shelling, but not to anything else. So if you imagine then that if you're in the front line, having stood to and not had any attack come, you would then be stood down, and a number of men would be detailed for guard duty, so they would be the ones left to keep an eye on everything. This could be fairly simple. You'd be in a trench and there'd be a periscope or something and you would keep an eye on it, and you would be just on the crest of the edge of the trench itself, on the inside edge, so you'd be ready should anything happen, and you'd be ready to ring the alarm, call the alarm, and you may be, depending on the circumstances, ring the gas bell should be set up in the trench to signal the approach of gas, particularly in the early part of the war or later in the war when there was a tendency for them to drop them by shells. So your first part of the morning had gone as we described, and then you get breakfast, and that would probably be in the British Army some bacon, some tea, some bread, and that would be your standard breakfast. And one pilot actually described passing over the Western Front on a major offensive day, and saying that you could see the two lines of trenches because both sides were now eating their breakfast at about 9 o'clock as they flew over. So they said it was quite interesting to see. So breakfast would be held, and obviously some men would be on watch, so you'd have to take turns and do that. And then once that was done, a lot of men would be trying to get some sleep. And as I'll explain, they would have probably not had much sleep during the night, so now's the time to try and get some sleep. It was also the time during the morning, perhaps, and into the afternoon, when the post corporal would come round, so that would mean post being distributed around the battalion in the trenches from home. People in Britain were allowed to post stuff to people in the armed forces, and they would put the regimental designation, 5th Battalion, Worcestershire Regiment or whatever, and then it was up to the army to make sure that the post got to the 5th Worcesters and was distributed accordingly. So, there was always a belief that the guys in the rear lines sort of grabbed the cake out of the parcels or whatever, but in fact a vast amount of it did get through, so the British soldier would be busy receiving his supplies, notes, letters. People would set up little groups to write to soldiers from their town. People would form comforts groups who would make socks and balaclavas and other things depending on the time of year, and send those out as well. So there was, and then you'd see circumstances. The Queen's Christmas box gift was the most famous, but towns would raise some money and send set of nice sort of bits of food to the soldiers. All the men of the town would get a packet of this, that and the other, including cigarettes. Cigarettes, of course, was the currency of the trenches. If you didn't smoke, you really did have a big opportunity to kill the market. selling cigarettes to those who did. So you would get through, and people would do very general duties, tidying up the trench a bit and so on. But a lot of the time, because of the risks of being observed, people would spend their time largely resting and recuperating from what had been a busy night. Clearly there would be opportunities for men to report sick, so if you were ill you could report to the battalion medical officer, and if the battalion medical officer decided you were sick you would then be allowed to go off, but that was obviously strictly monitored, and clearly there was a responsibility on the officers not to allow too many men away from the front line at any particular time. So that would go on through the day till lunchtime. Lunchtime would see the men get what was generally referred to as dinners, because lunch is a class-based concept in the English language. So lunch is something eaten by those who then have dinner in the evening, whereas dinner is what you have at lunchtime if you then have tea in the evening. So working class people, which would be the majority of those in the trenches, would have their dinners served up, hopefully hot, hopefully heated up in the trenches, mainly stew, things like that. Obviously there's a lot of research to be done on studying how much profit people made out of these dinners, but basically you've got a large tin with some vegetables and meat. Troops sometimes said they weren't sure where the meat was, but it was supposed to be meat in the stew, and you would heat that up and you would eat it along with more bread, as of course the bread was there. So you would have your stew and bread, and then some sort of steamed pudding was the most common thing to get heated up. So that would be your traditional things like spotty dick or steamed puddings of a variety of flavours, which you would then serve up. So quite a lot of stodge, but given that the men were undergoing the need to do a lot of physical hard work, they probably weren't going to not use the calories up, and so it provided them with their main meal of the day. During the afternoon, more people would obviously take a turn at being on duty in terms of the lookouts, general sort of keeping of appearances in the trenches, and that would then go on through till tea time. And clearly there would be the opportunities for the men. The post might arrive in the afternoon rather than the morning, depending on how long it's taken somebody to get it up there, and so on. So during the day, lots of attempts to try and rest, some effort required to go and do duties shared with your colleagues, and generally trying to keep your head down so you didn't get shot. Snipers were a big risk, so don't sit on the toilet at the latrine for too long in case somebody's decided that's a good place to ambush you from a sniper position. Another thing to bear in mind is the old cigarette thing. So avoid creating a situation where you were the third light, because the idea that one soldier would light a cigarette, touch the tips with the second soldier, and then the third, so the second would pass to the third, and that third light was matched by ready aim fire. So the belief was that a sniper who saw the first light would immediately think, well, it's going to be someone else. Oh, there's a second light, right, I'm looking at a group here, it's bound to be a third person, and sure enough, oh, there's that lit up, and they would fire at the light. So lots and lots of issues to try and keep safe, keep your head down, not expose yourself to enemy fire. was a common thing. So you get to about 5-6 o'clock, depending on the time of year. 5 in the winter, perhaps 6:30 in the summer. And at that point, things would start to begin to happen. So you'd get tea. Usually, battalions in the British Army were pretty good at making sure that the food got through and that they were served up. So the men would get their tea, which would consist largely of bread and jam. So they sort of bread, a margarine spread and jam, and they would have that for tea along with more tea. So the whole way in which the British Army operated took account of that. And it was one of the traditions of the British Army that officers made sure the men were fed before they themselves were fed. So the officers' dinners would follow on from having made sure that the men had already been fed. So a long-standing tradition in the British Army. So that's the point at which, between say 4 and 6, people would have started to receive their orders for the evening, stroke night. So battalion would be told, no, you're doing this, you're doing that. In the frontline trenches, you were less likely to be taken for what were called large working parties, but you would be required to do other jobs. So it would be during the night that you would put extra wire in front of your particular outpost, or you would tighten things up or clear things out or renew a trench board or things like that, because they automatically attracted attention. So, you know, that was one of your jobs. So if you imagine as the evening comes along, so the word is going round, right, A company, you're going to focus on this, B company, you get focused on that, or the whole battalion is going to be taken out and told to dig a trench in the dark. This is, as you can imagine, quite an interesting option to be given. So you would be told that you would go out into no man's land. You would stand in 2 rows facing each other, and each man would have a shovel, and you were required to dig a cubic yard of earth during your shift. So if you imagine the cubic yard would be 2 foot down, 3 foot down, and across, that would give you your cubic yard. Over 2 nights, you could therefore, if everything went smoothly, dig a trench, which would be 6 foot deep. And on the 3rd night, you can deepen it out and make sure that you built in some shelters and so on. So your primary role in that occasion is to dig. Now, we're talking about digging in the dark, alongside other guys and facing someone. So if you clash shovels, the Germans will hear you and will open fire. Just, because there must be somebody out there. So let's just, ping a quick bit of machine gun fire into there, see what happens. Put up a light. Let's see what's happening. So if you're out there on trench duty, you are struggling, because you really don't want to be digging this trench in the dark and get it wrong. But it was very hard work, and people did get injured and killed by speculative German fire. I mean, there was nothing to stop the Germans deciding there was bound to be somebody out there, so we'll give it a quick run over. But clearly, if you then fire into a group of men and one of them's howling completely naturally, howling because their ankle's been shot through by a bullet or whatever, then that will only lead to more bullets. So you need to administer a field dressing and get the guy out of there. So it's a very tough environment to be in, very stressful. Another thing that they had to do at night was wire their trenches. So you dig this trench. Once you've dug it, you've got to put some wire in front of it. So imagine you're first of all driving stakes into the ground. Okay, you can do that's fine. But then you've got to join them up with wire. And you're doing that using some very thick special gloves, and you're doing it in the dark. Not easy, and very, very hard work. So again, you don't want accidents, because if you have accidents, then the Germans will start firing. So that's a key part. Another thing that went on at night was patrolling. There was a belief in the British Army that you had to control and dominate no man's land if you were going to attack in future. So what did they have to do? Well, they'd send out a patrol, and the patrols could be officer patrols, led by an officer, usually a junior officer, second lieutenants most commonly, or it could be a small patrol led by a sergeant or some other NCO, and they would take a few men. And what would be their objective? Well, for example, find out where the Germans are. So go and find their trenches. Go and see if you can do anything with them. A trench raid is very different. This was a reconnaissance primarily. But if you happen to catch somebody on guard who was a bit slow to realise you were there, you might take them back to your HQ and get praised and thanked and possibly given a bit of fresh meal or a chance to be out of the line for a day. But basically, you would gather information. We went here, there was this, there was that. And later in the war, when you got masses of Mills bombs and things like that available, then you might get there, find there's no one in the dugout, but you might as well lob a grenade down there, just A, in case they've been very quiet, and B, so that when they come back to reoccupy the position, they're going to find that it's really not worth it.
So, just one of the questions, because there's this image about the soldiers lying in mud and sitting in mud, like spending all their day in mud. How did say in the British Army, soldiers keep clean during their time in the trenches?
Well, the essential truth is they didn't, because how would you keep clean? There was a certain esprit de corps in certain units to ensure that they shaved and things like that, and tried to keep tidy, but being clean was very difficult. I mean, you had the latrines, which were dug the regulation distance away from the trench, and then filled in, and it was somebody's job to go and fill it in, which was usually a job given to somebody who perhaps insulted the sergeant after a drunken night out during a relief period, and who was then selected specially to go and sort out a latrine. Or the other thing which the British brought in was the idea of a 6-weekly shower. Now, initially the 6 weeks shower meant you were hopefully, and I mean it wasn't guaranteed, but you would be taken out to a set of showers, told to strip off, go in the showers, have a shower, come back out, put your uniform on. Now, of course, what they realised after a while was that that was useless in the sense of, whilst it was nice for the men to be out and get showered, it wasn't much good if your uniform was full of lice, because all the lice would do is wait until you pulled your uniform back on, and then would reinvigorate themselves on you. So that didn't work so well. So then they started to bleach the uniforms. So effectively what happened was you get a uniform given to you which had come from someone else but had been cleaned, so that when you came out of the showers you could collect, if you like, fresh uniform. Fresh would probably be overstating it. But yes, so 6 weeks to get a shower, assuming nothing went wrong and messed up the schedule, was about the norm.
And because people seem to have this sort of, well, there are two images really. One of the men mucking it out literally in the trenches while the officers sit in French chateaus drinking wine and all that stuff, and the other one where all the ranks are mucking it in together. How far were conditions for officers and ordinary soldiers different or similar?
Well, that's really where the battalion officers are involved in a way which gives them credibility. So, for example, if you were a battalion officer, then you would have a little dugout in the front line. You would have a mess orderly who would prepare food for the officers. So the officers, as in previous times, had a servant who would get food ready and things like that. But they ate their food in the trench, in their little dugout in the trenches, the same as the men. And so up to the level of lieutenant colonel, officers were in the trenches with their men. Obviously you might be in a company of the battalion that didn't have the colonel with you. They would be with HQ company within the trench. But they were in the trenches with you, so whether you saw them that day or another day, it was irrelevant. You were there. Now, the image of sort of chateaus, wine swilling chateaus, has some truth to it, like a lot of these things. If you were a long way behind the lines, then and you were in a chateau, then at least you had a roof over your head, and if it rained, you didn't have to gallop your way through in galoshes just to get to the next unit. However, as I say, the vast bulk of officers would have been those up to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and therefore they were the ones who were with them. Now, obviously, you could be a captain serving on the divisional staff, and therefore be at the divisional headquarters, which often would be in a chateau. But the Blackadder image of dinner and wine and so on is much more the case if you're describing a senior command post, like corps and so on, but not involving people up to that level, as I say, that were with the battalion.
Well, thank you very much for being on the programme. Thank you to Millie and Alfie for joining us so calmly, and I hope to see you again soon.
Well, thank you very much for having me back. Hope that's given you an insight. What we should do, though, if I may, is just finish off by saying that that was what happened to the troops probably 1 week in four for they being in the front line. British battalions were in fours in brigade made up of 4 battalions till 1918. So what would typically happen is that one battalion would be in the front line, one would be in the support line, one would be in the reserve line, and one would be at rest, out of the line. Now, out of the line still left you within, a couple of hours march of the front line because you were the immediate reserve available. But nonetheless, if you imagine that you would do a week off, you would then go into the frontline trenches. Quite normally that was the way around they did it, and then gradually rotate yourself backwards through the lines to go for a rest again 4 weeks later. So there was a pattern of 7 days in, and then working your way back. So it doesn't mean that everyone did it that way. Some did it the reverse, but in some ways it was sort of like you've had your week out, where you might well get taken off for duty, so find yourself out every night building stiles or building trench material posts or digging trenches, so you could find yourself very busy at night, but you were out of the immediate line of fire, and you could relax, and you had a bed in some huts, and commonly they were in huts. So yeah, it was tough, very tough, but I thought that might just add a little bit of context to, a month would go by, you've spent 1 week in the front line, 1 week in the support line, 1 week in reserves, and you've had 1 week when technically you're out of the trenches. And then every so often a battalion would be moved to brigade reserve, So each battalion would be rotated. So typically the British Army operated with the 4 battalions, 2 up and 2 down, which meant that you had one behind the other. And then the battalions would rotate the companies within them, and you would go through. So you'd spend your period doing one bit of duty, then you do another. But every so often, one battalion in the brigade would be given a brigade rest, and then they would get out of the line. So then they'd have that opportunity to go and just be completely at a break from the front line. And it was those sort of things, of course, they dreaded being interrupted by an offensive, because they really looked forward to it.
Well, thank you again for the extra context, and I'm sure we'll come back to that at some other point in the series.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Again to Dr Simon Peaple for joining us on the programme, and we look forward to hearing more about life in the First World War, and it was lovely having you here.